Today we've got on our expert speaker number 6, Dean Gibson. Before we start, so in the spirit of reconciliation, my book club acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. This session and all of the content is being recorded for training, development and marketing purposes. My book club laws, before we do get started, there is no such thing as a bad question, no judgments allowed, and this is a safe environment free from all malicious, derogatory and disrespectful comments. So please adhere to these rules. If you don't, you will be kicked out of the group immediately. Every session starts on time, so if you are late, that's fine, just join in quietly. And of course, be present, be engaged, collaborate and learn as much as you can. Now we've got Dean Gibson joining us. You should be able to see him on screen. Dean is an Indigenous filmmaker, an Indigenous Australian filmmaker, who, if any of you have so far watched Incarceration Nation on SBS On Demand, he was the creator and director of that, which is pretty spectacular. I'm just gonna allow Dean to do the talking to begin with. How are you, Dean?
Yeah, really good, thank you, and thanks for having me. It's a privilege and honour to speak to you from Brisbane tonight.
And thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. I know I've watched Incarceration Nation. I know a fair few of the others have as well. So I'm going to hand it over to you to just give us an introduction into you and where you come from.
Great. Well, thank you. And yes, I guess firstly, I come to you from Brisbane. So I'm a filmmaker based in Brisbane. So I want to acknowledge the Yagara Turrbal people. I'm on the north side of Brisbane, so I acknowledge the traditional owners of Brisbane, where I am here tonight, and pay honour and respect to elders past, present, and of course emerging. Yeah, this is a privilege to be here, and thank you for having me. And I'm going to ramble around a little bit. We'll see where it goes. I hope it's engaging. I guess for me, my family come from far north Queensland, so I live in Brisbane, but my family come from a little town called Hopevale, a little Aboriginal community called Hopevale. So Hopevale is, if you go to Cairns on a holiday one day, you can get in a car and drive about 4 hours north to Cooktown, and then you drive another 45 minutes north of Cooktown. Will take you to the little town of Hopevale. So Hopevale is an Aboriginal community up there on the Cape. A lot of my family are up in Hopevale, and a lot of my family down, my mum's side of the family down and towards South Australia. An interesting thing about my family is that, you know, and I'll get into this later on, but I come from quite a bit of a broken, like probably many of us, bit of a broken family, and in many ways, I've been removed from a lot of my Aboriginal history over my lifetime. So the process of making your films, for me, has not just been about creating content for Australia or the world. It's actually been a big part of that has been about defining or trying to understand or get an understanding or a sense of who I am, who my family are, and what my story is. About 2 weeks ago, I actually went up to Hopevale for my uncle's funeral, and that was the first time. My kids are 9 and 10, and that was the first time that they had actually gone up to Hopevale and met my family. And yeah, there's reasons around that, but it was really exciting and enjoyable, and they had a great time to sort of understand and see that side of their story and their narrative, which I've talked about, but for them to actually for the first time go and experience and meet cousins and uncles and grandparents, and they met their grandfather, so my father, they met him for the first time in their life. So that was a pretty, I stepped into that situation not knowing what's going to play out, but it was a really special kind of thing. and they will take something from that and do as they move forward in their life in that relationship as well. So that's where all my family come from. So I guess from a film sense, I've been a filmmaker for almost probably 15 years now. I studied at Griffith Film School, so that's a film school here in Brisbane. And I guess I grew up in a household of National Geographic magazines. I loved reading stories about people from far-fetched corners of the earth, seeing all those photos that they put on the front page. We all know that young Afghan girl, that iconic photo that you see in it. I remember seeing that and seeing photos like that and really being empowered and really being, I guess, getting a sense of how powerful and how important telling a story is, and what fantastic imagery can do when you bring story and imagery and narrative and music and I guess words and all these things around a story. And it just drove me to that area. And I was that kid in school who was walking around with a camera. I love sport. I had a cricket bat in one hand and a camera in the other hand. I just loved filming. So I was that guy filming everything. But yes, went to film school, went through film school there, and really, I think I got to, again, I think you got to understand with my journey, I'm slowly building these little pieces of my own life as I'm stepping along. I'm starting with a little mound here, and as my journey in making films, understanding Aboriginal culture and history and my story, I'm building this sort of blocks that get me to where I am today. So I come out of film school pretty green, but working in the industry here around Brisbane, and I always tell people, speak at the film school, and people say, what's your advice? And I always tell them the story that, I probably went through film school with about 30, 40 students, and I reckon there's about 4 of us or 5 of us actually in the industry now. And I think it really taught me the idea that resilience and the idea that you have to really dig in and be prepared to be the last man or woman standing to try and to get those opportunities. And I think that's what I really tell them, is that you need to not, if you really believe in it, you can't let it go. If you let it go, there'll be easier choices in life to make regarding your career, or things you can do that might be something over there where there's a good job, nothing wrong with the job, good job, but it's not the thing that you really in your heart want to do. So it's like fight for that. Fight for that under everything. Like, don't walk away feeling like you haven't put it all on the table. You got to fight for it. And then I guess, so I was in that space, and then I was lucky enough that my big break in my life in my production life was the advent of NITV. Now, NITV is at the moment, now they're under SBS, but before that, they were actually brought as a third public network. So they were the really baby, really. And NITV, I can't remember what their budget was, but it wasn't a lot. And you had this network who was effectively working on the Snip and Oily Rag. Now that kind of sets itself up as that's a really hard hill to climb. But in other ways, that's actually exciting to be innovative and try different things and really push the way that you make things. So NITV came along, and then that was really the advent of really empowering Aboriginal filmmakers, production companies, and really trying to build the sector. It wasn't just about writers, it wasn't just about directors, because you had the big crew of Warwick Thorntons and Wayne Blair's, all those guys over there, generally working through the AFTRS way and getting their opportunities over there. But then there was this other little pathway over here called NITV, and that really made a concerted effort to reach out into the regions of Australia and try and see who is doing what and trying to empower them with productions and opportunities. I think I was working for a company called Carbon Media, and we were doing lots of different things, kids shows. Early on, you're trying to just find your feet in the production world. You're working on different things, kids shows, small documentaries, little news things, travel shows, all these different music shows, all these things that just, again, a bit like that, you're just trying to build your skills, build your ability. And for me in my career, the way that I've sort of always operated is that get given a small budget, do it on time, do it amazingly well, do it on budget, and then you'll get more next time. And slowly the trust between yourself and the networks and the broadcasters builds, and they can see that you can deliver on time, within budget, a high quality film or product or series. So yeah, NITV came along, all those opportunities came. And then I think, I guess my first really big exciting production was a documentary I did for ABC called From the Ashes. And that was that I mentioned before, cricket. That brought together my love of cricket and filmmaking, because I got to tell the story of the Aboriginal cricket team that travelled to the UK in 1868. So the first 68, the first Australian sporting team to go overseas and play for Australia was this Aboriginal cricket team, and they were from that sort of area in WA towards Warrnambool, around Victoria towards Warrnambool, that area around there, Horsham, around that area. A lot of these cricket players and Aboriginal men were sort of picked up there, put on a cart, taken down to the Geelong, put on a boat, went around to Sydney, and then from Sydney they were taken over to the UK and did, I think they played about 50 games or something, mainly exhibition games. And it was really interesting to sort of make that little show for ABC and explore the social questions around that, the ethics around that a little bit, because they were very much, the players were very much used, it was a money-making venture, and some say it was a money-making venture, some say it was it was giving people opportunities, whichever way you want to call it. But this team snuck out of Australia. They went around the laws of the nation at the time, snuck out, went and were stars in London and the UK for this period of time, and then they came back to Australia, and then they were, like you hear in the stories in the war about Aboriginal people who served, they weren't just sort of put back in society and given equal rights as the other serving servicemen and women. They were actually put back down their run through the White Australia laws and policies. So same with these cricketers. A lot of them just came back and became stockmen, sent out to work on properties, and really not much of a life, a cricket life beyond that. So that was what we did in that film, was we tracked a current cricket team, Aboriginal cricket team, and we got a couple of guys to sort of tell that story of that old team. After that, I made a film called War of Hope. Now that's a really interesting film, because that's a film about my family's journey. So up in Hopevale, that in the Second World War, these people were evacuated, considered prisoners of war. That the minister of the mission was considered a prisoner of war, a spy, and he was put into prison. And these Aboriginal people of Hopevale were shipped halfway down to Queensland and put into a place called Woorabinda, which is it's sort of halfway down the state inland, and it's a cold location. So you had these tropical people brought down, put into Woorabinda over this, and they were there for not just sort of the period of the war, but they were there for like 7 years. So a third of these people died in Woorabinda, and it was a story of them coming back to Hopevale and replanting their seeds of their land. Then I went on to Wick versus Queensland, and that was a film that told the story of the Wick people and their battle for the native title laws and the High Court cases, where they, in the 90s, they took on the mining giants and up in Cape York Peninsula, big bauxite mines, and they fought for their native title up in their Wick country. So I was lucky enough to get a lot of archive footage from the Cape York Land Council and Noel Pearson and people like that, and Marcy Langton, seeing this advent of this big movement from Cape York from 30 years ago, 35 years ago, this old video footage, and we told the narrative of that story of the Wick people and their journey, and that was a really amazing chance to use archive and tell a story of the people who had fought for their native title, who had won the case. But if you remember, then Prime Minister John Howard had his 10-point plan, and a lot of watering down of native title, and they pretty much, effectively sent the Wick people back up to Arakan with their tails between their legs and told, go back in your place, and we're gonna just create a series of laws to actually in some levels supersede or overcome that decision by the High Court. And then, then I guess for me, then it was then under several little things, but then the big one of incarceration came, and then that was about a 4-year journey to get where it got to today on the screen. And that was a really, we can talk about that soon, but that was a really tough, given the content, a really tough, powerful, but really empowering. And again, I think the beauty of making the film is I still have to sort of scratch my head and think about the fact that I'm getting opportunity, I'm getting paid, I'm lucky enough to be paid to make these kind of things, and given the opportunities to go and the honor to actually sit with people and listen to their stories and share that. And people say, well, how do you do that? Like, where do you start? And I say, well, the first thing I do is actually go in and just shut my mouth. I just want to listen and understand and really get that sense of empathy and really see where people are coming from. I think that's the really important part. We could have made a really big film, and all the big films that I've made, you could make a really big film that covers all the big themes, ticks all the big national headlines and all that. But fundamentally, I think we all know, and it's no different to books and what we're all reading, is that you bring it down and you find where it lands in a person or in a family or in a situation, and you start to get the humanity come from within that. And I love that this book that you're all reading is talking about vulnerability, and I think that's kind of the privilege of my job, is that I get to go in and meet people who are prepared to lay it up, like are prepared to sort of sit down and understand and recognize and put faith in what I do and put trust in who I am and the character of me to do that. And they come forward and people come forward and go, I want you to be help us tell the story of our family, or tell the story of our country or our land or whatever it is. And I guess you all will have a talk about this, but I think I was just saying earlier that there's some really, I think it's a fantastic book, and it's got so much of this book can speak to Australia, to Aboriginal Australia, and speaks to the situation that sort of lays in front of Aboriginal Australia today and where we've come from. For me, there's this one particular chapter. It's The Wisdom of the Process by Prentice Hemphill, and he really talks really strongly about historical violence. And sorry, I'm just looking at my notes over here, but he's talking about historical violence and traumatic memories, and the idea that it's something that's been suppressed over generations. Sometimes, and again, I'm just speaking for what I've learned. I don't speak for all of Aboriginal Australia. I just speak for what I've sort of seen and get a sense of in my own life, but also what I see when I meet other people, is that this stuff exists all across the country for Aboriginal Australia, and the trauma and the historical violence has never really truly been spoken about in great detail or great depth. It does amongst the Aboriginal communities, but beyond that, I haven't seen really big signs of that yet. And hopefully that's something that can begin to allow Aboriginal people to let that sort of come up and rise out, because I think it is suppressed in Aboriginal people today. And that, sadly, as you read in the book, and I think you see it through all these stories, that sadly manifests its way in other ways of life which aren't healthy or helpful. I think there's a great point he makes in this thing about when all you got to do is survive, it's almost a luxury to heal and to become vulnerable. Like when the number one, and I think when in the film, when I made Incarceration Nation, talked to a lot of those families, they don't have time to even think about what's going on because it's all about survival. It's all about just trying to get to the next day or get to the next rent or get the kids to school or get whatever it is. Like there's almost a lot of, the urgency was so strong amongst people wanting to share their stories and actually talk about what's going on in their lives, is that it didn't actually allow the luxury of healing or the luxury of actually slowing down and acknowledging vulnerability and the role that being vulnerable and how that can actually help begin to turn that around. Because I think, you know, the two of the biggest disadvantages, and particularly when I talk to incarceration, the drivers are poverty and disadvantage. So you put those two things on the table, and you can kind of tell when you got to speak to people, was it if you give them a 2-hour interview, it's like for the first time they can just sit down and actually almost forget about the pressures of life and things coming around them to actually just give it to you and share that. And that was a really intense, powerful interviews. I think another really big thing that he talks about is culture being lost and healing being lost and the pathways to identities being lost. And I think, you know, call it colonisation, call it whatever I don't really care what you want to call it. But the fact is that Aboriginal people feel, and not all, but a lot that I've seen and speak to feel like that sometimes they feel like that they're getting their identity has been taken away. And like me, I guess at some levels, I'm rebuilding it and people are doing the same thing. And I think if you don't have the ability to travel or the ability, like if things are up against you in disadvantage and poverty, it can become really hard. And I've seen all across Australia where it's really hard to begin to find your own identity and find your own pathways and senses of healing. Thank goodness that that's been recognised now, particularly around the mental health and the well-being stuff, that people are, that health and happiness and well-being are being sort of recognised and seen. Because I think you can see that amongst communities in Australia where some of the places I've visited and filmed, that things are like that are being recognised and are finding that that's where the potential solutions and answers do lie. There's another really good one that I really liked in here, which is Steps to Being Whole on Your Terms by Aiko D. Bethia. And what I really liked about that was that she spent a lot of time talking about moving forward. I think again, and I have to be careful about this in the way that I make films. You can cast your eyes back and look at things in the past, and you can do that so much. And I do that in my films and edits sometimes, and go, I'm forgetting to look forward. I'm forgetting to look at what our capacity and what our opportunities and what our strengths and talents and all that, and all these kind of things. And I think that's what she really touches on really nicely, is that we sort of fall into the traps of assimilation and striving for acceptance. And that's not just Aboriginal people, that's all of us. We do that. I do that. Just today I was in a board meeting and I wanted to say something. I thought, oh yeah, I'm not going to say it. And I regret I didn't say it. And it's like I was almost just wanting to sort of toe the line a little bit on some things. And then she talks about fighting fire with fire, and people would argue that's important. And then the idea of hiding under a radar. So I think what I've learnt in making Incarceration Nation is that Australia is at a really interesting crossroad where I think the urgency for change, I hope, particularly when it comes to Aboriginal people and incarceration and the justice system, the urgency is too strong to just sit under a rock and let things pass over and hope that things will get better. It won't. It clearly won't. Historically, if you look at the trajectory of where we've come from and where we're going, it's not improving. It's clearly going that way. And I say that way in a bad way. And putting your head under a rock is not an option. And you learn that when you talk to the people who've actually lost a son, or a family, a mother who's lost a son, or someone who's lost their cousin or their mother. People in our film who we spoke to spoke about that, and go, they are speaking with urgency because they can't afford not to. And we shouldn't, as a nation, have that mentality that we just put our head down. And not that you have to be in the moment every moment of the day. We all need our own rest and time out. But the urgency, this stuff is really necessary, and particularly when it comes to the people within power. I really liked how she spoke about, for Aboriginal, well, she said Black people, I'll say Aboriginal people, I'll adapt it. And, it's about deconstruction and naming. She said about a ways about finding your identity. And she said deconstruction and naming. And to me, that represents people strategically being in corporations, boards, governments, bureaucracy, all these parts of life where we have the wisdom and the strength and the understanding and the ability to actually infiltrate some of these places, for a better word, infiltrate these areas of our society and actually name it and call it when you see it on a day-to-day basis, as I probably should have today in this meeting. She talks about community and connection, and I think we all know what that is, and we know the power of a village in our own lives, creative possibilities, and that, I think that's really important for my work, where we can lay up expression and dreams and vision and inspiration. Just at a barbecue the other night, a friend of mine said, I was trying to tell my son that, look at Dean, he's working in the creative arts and he's actually sticking to what he's sticking to, and he's actually finding a way to, as a mum, he's actually making, he's actually surviving, he's getting money and he's living and he's doing, it's like, I think it's really important that we need to inspire that generation. And then she talks about spirituality and purpose. And then I think it's really interesting, she flips it in that article, and she talks about, for white people, it's about having a learner mindset. And I think for me, in making this film, I really wanted to create a film that did have a learner mindset, and made a film that would I didn't want to create a film in Incarceration Nation that would turn people off. I wanted people to just rest in it, feel awkward, feel uncomfortable, feel unsettled, but not just be told and shamed out of turning it off. I wanted people to just understand it and create some empathy around that and have that learner mindset. She then talks about acknowledging privilege and inequity. And I think the power and the roles of justice system are clear around that. There are choices that white people can make in society and in places of power, and how they can choose to deal with people who have less authority and less power and less influence, and it's about building that up. But I think the most important point she makes is bravery, because ultimately, if you look at the mathematics, Aboriginal people make up 3 to 4% of the population. So fundamentally, Aboriginal people are relying on 97% of the population of Australia to come to the table with goodwill. Think about that. It's 3% and 97%. That's, I don't know, I'm not a bookmaker, but those odds don't look great. So I think that idea that recognizing that and understanding the responsibility that comes with that, but not just the responsibility. I think, when you watch tourism ads for Australia, I always have to have a bit of a laugh, because what do you see? Beaches, You might see some, so what do you see? Beaches, you might see some capital cities, and then you see Aboriginal Australia. Like it's one of the big things that these big tourism bodies choose to sell, our nation chooses to sell to the world. So I think until we, and I say we, all of us, and particularly recognise that until Aboriginal people are recognised as a special and unique relationship to the land and to this country, and that we can add to that. Like, we're not just a baggage that you just grab on and carry that 3% over the shoulder and take it on the journey with you. It's about bringing that 3% of really unique, special people who have a really distinctive relationship to the land and to this country, bringing them into that room and into that table and recognised and affirmed as the First Nation owners, or the First Nation owners and people of this country. I don't think we will, until that bravery can really play out across, not just, and we always point to Canberra, but doesn't start. I think it's the other way. We need to point to our families, our friends, and if we can swing it that way and get it, if it has to be Canberra last, so be it. But I think that's where probably the most important thing is having the bravery to be vulnerable and recognising all these things. So I've probably talked for too long. So that's me. I love reading this. I love giving the opportunity to talk a little bit about it and what its relationship and its correlation with this Aboriginal Australia, if it has any relevance or similarities, and I think it has a lot. Can we learn from them, from America? I don't know. I don't know America that well. Maybe we can. Maybe they can learn something from us. I don't know. But so that's my journey, and I don't know where I go next or what's next on my cards. But Incarceration Nation was a big film to make, which took a lot of toll, but it was, I'm really proud of everything that we did and what we made of it, and I guess, open it up to talking about that, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. That was so enjoyable to listen to you talk through your story so candidly and weave your own life experience into it, which is so important, being one of the themes of this month as well, lived experience. So thank you. And I guess I'd like to leave with the first question and staying on the documentary Incarceration Nation. There are a lot of statistics there that I think many people in Australia would not be aware of, with Indigenous people being some of the most incarcerated on earth, Aboriginal, Australian Indigenous people. Why, in your opinion, or from your experience being out and hearing stories, why is progress and change and reform so slow?
Yeah, it's a really good, and I guess really this is the beauty of making this film, is that I came in I didn't have any really extensive history in the justice system. So I've learned so much on this journey myself, and I don't sort of claim to be the doyen on this, but I think, it comes down to I think it's a lot of the attitudes that I think it comes back to that 97%. It's sometimes it feels like it's not my problem, it's their problem, and if I talk about them, those Aboriginal people or whatever, I always get in trouble. So I'm not going to talk. It's not going to be my problem. I've got my own problems in my life, and that's going to be over there. I think it also has historic. It's partly that, but I also think it's got a lot of historical roots, and I think that was evident in the research. Is that the big thing is that this stuff is not of 10 years or 20 years in the making. This stuff dates right back to when the Europeans first arrived, to the English arrived. and along with that came laws, policies, emissions, religion, all these factors that have got, not by chance, but by design, got us to where we are today. And I think it's like, I think there's a quote in here, I went to write it down. It was something like, if it takes so long to do that, it's going to take twice as long to turn it around, or something like that. Like, I don't know why it takes long. You'd hope that people who have the power have a willingness to see. That's the problem with the colony. I call it the colony, but the systems in place were designed to actually fundamentally kill or move Aboriginal people on and take their land. And I think the truth is we haven't dealt with that. And until that's dealt with, I think that's going to be like, you know, it's like a counselling session. Until you deal with the big stuff and you move the blocks out the way, you won't get the path through. And I think for me, that's probably where the biggest slowdown probably lies. About five answers, sorry.
No, and I think, I'm sure there's more than 5.
Yeah.
And I mean, that kind of leads us into the first theme of the book, which is vulnerability, acting as a potential roadblock for progress. I mean, would you agree with that comment, that for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, that we have to all be vulnerable and be a little bit uncomfortable before progress can even begin?
Yeah, that's really, it's interesting, you know, because people would say to me when we were making the film, who's the film for first? And I would say, look, NITV have paid for it, so fundamentally it's for Aboriginal people. But part of it, I wanted to make it was a lesson for for non-Aboriginal people who have an interest and who want to learn more about it and understand it. So I think there's got to be that level of vulnerability, and I don't know how. Yeah. Sorry, what was your question again?
I mean, talking about becoming uncomfortable and
yeah, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, Jenny. Uncomfortable. Yeah, that's right. Like, I wanted to make people feel uncomfortable and understand what it's like. Like, I wanted to make. I want an audience, and a white part of the audience, to watch it and think, okay, particularly the film part of the film where it focused on children. I wanted people to understand that is not that far from their own home. Like, it's not that far that their child could be in that situation, and albeit their child is not Aboriginal, that could be one of the reasons, you know. I wanted the people to understand that it's such a fine line that can get a kid into one of those detention centres, which then begins the journey of a life of bouncing from facility to facility and ultimately ending up in a prison, an adult prison, that's sitting right beside the juvenile system. And until we, I wanted people just to see that and understand that and know that could be, it could be real, and so it's not far from them. And I think, I hope I achieve that.
I know it was a very confronting experience when I watched it. Maybe confronting is not the right word, but it was definitely something that I didn't know a lot about. So being, I think, like you said, I'm one of the 97%, where for most of my life it has been, it's not that it's not my problem, but it's just never even been on my radar.
Yeah.
So one thing I will say really quickly to everyone watching, we will open it up to questions from everyone towards the end, but if you do have questions that are popping into your head now, please put them in the chat and we'll open up those questions as we go through. And we'll take you off mute so that you can ask your question and have a conversation with Dean. But what I wanted to ask Dean is, for the people that haven't seen Incarceration Nation yet. A lot of it, like you said, there was a lot of stories. There was a lot of interviews with people telling their stories, and there was a lot of research.
Mm.
What's some of the research that really popped out that shows what Incarceration Nation is representing?
Yeah, I think it's what I sort of touched on before. It really is, this stuff is not of 20 years in the making, or it's not about antisocial behaviour. It's not about these things that you associate immediately with incarceration. It's intergenerational trauma. Like, it's these things that we can identify today, which we haven't previously had the courage or the ability to identify intergenerational trauma and what that begins to look like. And what these guys touch on as well, what it begins to manifest over time. For me, seeing, it's identity being wrapped around incarceration is a really sad part of it as well. The idea that people don't feel full, they feel like they need to go to some level of empowerment to take on that and get down that trajectory and down that path for manhood or whatever. But I think for me, the historical stuff I was saying earlier is that we need to make it clear, this is not by chance. This is by legislation. And I think Josh, in one of our barristers in the film, makes a great point. He says, let me tell you a story. If I was an Aboriginal person in Queensland in the 1960s, and 50s or 60s, he said, and I was a 12-year-old, I would be told to leave school when I get to 11 or 12. I wouldn't be able to go and study, I would be able to do no more education. I'd be told to go out and then work for someone and get a job anywhere in Queensland, leave my family and go get a job anywhere in Queensland. And I'm not allowed to keep my wages. So they get held by the state. So I don't get access to I can't create wealth for my own life, my own family, or my own for me personally. So I'm out there doing that. And then, and then, he said, I can, you control where you can go, all that sort of stuff. But fundamentally, let's flip it around. If I was able to do all that, I could go and get a job. I could go and keep my money. I could buy a house in Brisbane and have a place to live and have some level of wealth around me and my family. But up until stolen wages was only 1980s. Like in Queensland, 70s and 80s, there was still things going on. Like my old man, he had wages that he wasn't able to claim and all that sort of stuff. But this is in the 80s. This is not that long ago when Aboriginal people couldn't accumulate their own wealth to actually own their own place. Like, and people say, well, why don't they own houses? Why don't they own a house and get on with life and do it? It's like, they actually couldn't do it. They couldn't do it till laws in Queensland. Like, this stuff was happening in the 70s and early 80s. It's like, this is not that long ago. So I think all these factors that got us to where we are today all play a role in the power of Aboriginal people feeling like they've been put on this pathway, this trajectory. And once you're on that trajectory, particularly if poverty is involved, it's a hard one to get off. Like, we could see that in all the research, is that once you're on that trajectory, it's a really hard road to get off. And particularly if you get on at a young age, you are trapped in that cycle. And I think that plays itself to why recidivism rates are high, is because it's a really hard road to get off once you're on it. And particularly if it's all you know. I think Keenan Mundine says, people go, why do Aboriginal people and police not get along? It's like Aboriginal people going back, the police was the force of the law arriving at their door and taking their family away from them, taking their siblings away. So from day one, you had Aboriginal people running, and we've all seen that scene in Rabbit Proof Fence, people running away and police being that person who has to take these kids away. And that relationship there is evident today through foster care and all those other aspects of life. And that is why particularly the relationship in that space is not that great. So there's all these historical things, and it's easy to just point to antisocial behaviour, but there's so much, like an onion, there's so many layers going on.
Yeah, of course. So then, I mean, it's a bit of a combination there, isn't it, of what is happening today and what has happened over the last 200 years or so. It's not a simple answer, which I think when people ask questions like this, they're expecting an answer that they can get some clarity from and go, okay, well then I'll just do this. But it doesn't sound like it's that simple.
Well, I think that was always, that was always a challenge of how do we once we get to the back end of the film, how do we start to show people, do we show people hope? What do we actually want to leave people feeling off the back of the film? And where do we land that, like, solutions? Like, do we show solutions? So we wrestle with that, and that was a hard one, because you never really, some things are working, some aren't working. There's people who are prison abolitionists who said, well, why didn't you show that in the film? And we can't show everything in the film, but I think what we want to try and show in the film is that until the reins of power were handed back to Aboriginal people in their local area with local ideas and local champions and solutions, until you even consider that process, it's still always going to be that authority from the top down being told, you be in your place, you be there, you do that, which is kind of the systems of the last 200 years of the nation. And it's trying to find that localized solutions and to try and unpack what it is and what is best suited for each individual community.
I think, Dean, I'd love to hear a bit more on when you were out making Incarceration Nation and hearing these stories of lived experience. And if we tie it into the book again, there's a story in the book called This Joy I Have, Austin Channing Brown. And I'll read out a quick quote from it to lead into the question, but it's, racism is the silent stalker, always willing to wring joy from our lives. When my husband is in the car, I fear not only the possibility of an accident, but the possibility of an officer taking his life. For me, that was one of my most profound moments in the book, to think that was somebody's lived experience as they're probably having their morning breakfast, heading out to work in the morning. Would it be safe to say there are similar stories in Aboriginal Australia of that fear from the top down of organizations and the police force, the court, the justice system?
Yeah, I think that's, and we touched it, yes, absolutely. And everyone we spoke to, I think everyone's had a story to talk about around police. And we wanted to talk about police, and we didn't want to police bash. Like, I didn't want to do that in the film. I just wanted to sort of, and it's easy to say it's a couple of eggs that ruin the force and all that. And that's not, I think there's some bigger systemic things in there that need to be dealt with. Over that kind of, there's a couple of bad eggs in the force. But every family we spoke, every person I interviewed had an experience, and not a great experience with police, where they were hassled, whatever. And I think I said, I asked everyone the question, do you think people recognise the power they actually have in a situation to start a kid on a trajectory of crime and incarceration, or go to them, okay, I could take you down that path, but I'm going to take you down this way, and we're going to get you back whatever you need to do to get yourself sorted. And that's really becomes evident with Auntie Tanya Day's story, which is that story from she died up at Castlemaine, in the cell there in Castlemaine, where her daughter April, we spoke to her, and she was a really powerful, strong woman. And April talked about the fact that Auntie Tanya died and was picked up rather off the train and put in a cell, and then half hour later they got a white woman at the Cumberland pub or something, and they drove her home. And it shows you that at that point in time, choices can be made, and the power that they have in that opportunity to take the person home or whatever, or put them into a health service, or, I mean, wouldn't that, wouldn't taking Tanya Day to a health facility be a better choice than taking to a police cell? Or, there's so many choices right there. But in saying all that, and I'm not letting people off the hook, but another really interesting thing is that we talked about was trauma. I think, and we have to have the maturity to understand, and Aboriginal people need to understand this too, I think, is that trauma goes two ways. You've got people, police, prison, all these people, that's a whole industry of trauma. Like that's people working in these spaces which are seeing things, being part of things that are just, they can't be ignored. Like they are in that on a day-to-day basis. So to think that they're not suffering some level of pain and systemic trauma would be naive of all of us to think. Like, and they manage that whole industry and world. And until we actually recognize, really truly support that as well, I don't think we'll. It was a really interesting point he made, the clinician made to me, and it's like it almost like a light bulb. I don't think we don't think about that kind of trauma that sits over there. And I think until part of the healing or part of the dealing with that, those kind of professions needs to be recognised and supported as well, because we know what trauma, what the behaviour of some of those things. Where does that, we know what that is, and that, where does that come from? It comes from all that stuff. And until we have that vulnerability, like you say, and the ability to actually step into that and have the courage and strength to actually step into it and address it in our own worlds, we're going to get those bad eggs more and more.
Yeah. That's one of the, another question that we had on our questions list was along the lines of why is there such a lack of training from prison officers? And I'm sure there's not a lack of training. They obviously have to be highly trained people. But there are stories of, like you said, stories of that, and then some of the video footage that you see in Incarceration Nation. People shouldn't act like that. It's not a normal way to act. It's not a normal way to treat a 12 or 15-year-old boy. Do you think it is a matter of training, or is it's obviously quite linked to that trauma as an official that's on the other side that probably isn't spoken about that much? Do you think that there is a training protocol or something that can come into place that would assist?
Oh, clearly that would help. I just think I think empathy, I think that's the biggest thing which we all can do without having to go to a course. Like, it's just empathy, the idea of just sitting or understanding where people are coming from and having some level of empathy or in that. And that doesn't require anything other than you sitting down and listening and being part of that. And I'm not saying everyone needs to go and do that tomorrow, but I think if we're going to put people under the care of the state, We need people and systems in place which are empathetic to the people who, you can't go and blame 10-year-olds for things. I mean, you just can't blame a 10-year-old for something and then treat them like an adult. And it just doesn't, we all know what it was like being a 10-year-old. I mean, do they think we should be putting 10-year-olds into those kind of facilities, or 11-year or 12-year-olds? It's like, I think that's the clearly the first easiest thing that people need to have the courage to actually do exactly what this book says: be vulnerable, understand where people are coming from, and apply that. And that might sound simple, and that might sound a little bit naive. People go, "Oh, well, you don't have to deal with people pissing on me and rah, 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 and these kids being whatever." It's like, well, can you see the power playing out here? You're up here, he or she's down here. So that can't be played out, and particularly can't be played out in a state democratic facility which we all fund and support. That's unacceptable. Like, putting aside humanity, as a democratic nation which believes in all our principles which we claim, that is just unacceptable.
Agreed. And not enough steps being made. And I was interested to know, talking about those things like vulnerability and shame, resilience, is there more of an impact being made across the Indigenous community, in the absence of a lot of effort from government, federal, state organizations? But when we look at people like Keenan and Carly and organizations like Deadly Connections, is that where the real change is going to begin, from the grassroots, for want of a better word?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And really, that you could, that I love that. I mean, it's probably my favorite scene of Incarceration Nation, where Keenan sits down with a bunch of guys at Redfern Park, and they're all just a rough old runabout, ragtag bunch of fellas from all different walks of life, and he just sits with them and he just listens, and that he feeds them and he just listens. And I just walked away and thought, that is so much in that subtext in that moment that could be a lesson for us all. And the idea that if you look around Australia, I reckon you probably ask people in this space, all this health, legal services and all those kind of services, say, well, what's working in your neighbourhood? What's working in your neck of the woods? I guarantee probably a vast majority would say it's all about those localised groups, clubs, sports clubs, organisations, health services, schools, all these little local things, doing things in our own area to actually empower people to feel like they're valued and they've got, they're part of something bigger, they're part of the village, I guess. So yes, and to their credit, I guess Keenan comes with so much more, because he's been he was one of those, he had the ability, or he was, I guess, not the ability, he just had, he took the steps that he needed to take to get off that road and come back. And he still admits he struggles with things, and that's the beauty of, vulnerability and shame, resilience and all that sort of stuff, is that he says, I can still fall over, I get it wrong, we get it wrong. And it's the ability to actually recognize that and go, I can make a mistake, but the sun's coming up tomorrow and I'll do my best to rectify it, or whatever I need to do. And I think that was a really big thing for him, and just seeing how that his life has sort of played out, and the way that he's reinvested in his local community and all that sort of stuff, and the battles, yes, but all those sort of things he had to deal with in life. I think the other big part is truth telling. I don't know if we've talked about truth telling. I think that's a really important thing as a nation. I think I've talked locally. I think nationally, the idea of truth telling is really, really vital. And if you said to me, what's the next big chapter in our nation, I would probably say that's what it probably should be. And I don't know exactly what that begins to look like yet. There's probably a lot smarter people than me in that space. But the idea that we need to are we prepared to talk about the reality and the truth of the nation? And if so, what does it look like? And how does that conversation look like? And what can we hope to achieve, sort of walking through the pain of all that, and then what does that open up to as a nation?
Yeah, and I think in line with the book, you may agree that it probably begins with stories of lived experience.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing. As a filmmaker, one of the criticisms of Incarceration Nation was it's a little bit of what do you call it, poverty porn, and it's I look, I think I've created a bigger narrative than just sort of moments of poverty porn, which is just showing it for the sake of it. I hope that I sort of put it in context of the whole footprint, and I think that's I was going to say lost it. Yeah, that was a really important thing that was a criticism, but it's like, no, yeah, these stories are there, and what role as filmmakers or artists or writers, whatever, painters, whatever, what role do we all have in truth telling, and how much do we want to put forward? Like, is it everything? And are we ready for that? Do we have the guts, the vulnerability, the courage, and that? What did I say? Is it the bravery? Do we have the bravery to actually step into that as a nation?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna open up. We've had a couple of questions come through.
Right.
I'm gonna open up to them in just a second. I did want to ask on what you were just saying. So in order to be vulnerable, or like the other side of the book and the conversation there is shame resilience.
Mm.
And in order to be vulnerable, you have to overcome shame. But for a lot of Aboriginal people, or a lot of people, there is that trauma that makes it very difficult, mainly because of fear, like the repercussions of putting their hand up and telling their story authentically.
Yeah.
How would you, like, aside from putting it in a documentary and telling it through film, how could we engage in those conversations? Because there are people, there's a lot of racist people out there still.
What did Paul Roos say about Adam Goods?
We actually didn't talk about that part.
I mean, that's a really interesting situation, isn't it? Like Adam's story, where he got called a name from the girl on the sideline. He stepped up, and he was all about trying to he wasn't trying to shame her out. He was actually trying to reach out to her and teach her, and then he gets called out for that. I don't know. That's a big question.
Yeah.
I don't know. Because look, the way I make films is there's always going to be that group of people who I will never change their mind. I like to think I can make something that can, but the reality is there's just some I can't. But that is relying on that goodwill, and it's a really hard line to stand on. For Aboriginal people, I think that relying on that goodwill of 97%, it's like walking on thin ice. It's a really hard step to take, and to get in there and do that together takes a lot of courage from everyone. Yeah, I haven't really answered the question, I don't think, but it's hard.
No, yeah, and some of these questions that we were talking about earlier today, there aren't really answers to them.
Which is hard. You're right. You're just right. Sorry, it's hard because you're right. The media looks for really quick answers. They look for easy responses. People don't have time to sit in uncomfortable places for days or years and think about it. People want things now, and that's really hard when you're dealing with such big banks of historical violence and trauma.
Yeah. I'm going to open it up to Deanna. Do you want to ask your question, Dee? Cannot hear you just yet.
Sorry, guys, can you hear me?
There we go. Much better.
Hi, how are we doing? I'm really loving this discussion. I actually just wanted to ask, obviously I know the answer isn't as clear cut as we would like it to be, but is there something we can do each day to be closer to being a part of a solution rather than contributing to the problem? I know obviously, you know, we can make big gestures and all of that, but is there something we can do in our day-to-day lives to contribute positively, I guess, is my question.
Hi, Deanna. How are you going? Thank you for the question. Look, yeah, I think there is. I think it can start in our workplaces. I think it can start in our sports clubs. I think all those, the conversations it's calling things out when we see it, having the courage to call things out when we hear it or see it. I think that's really important. I think it comes a bit back to the idea of opportunities and trying to not just call the negative stuff out or the stuff that creates the trauma, but look forward about where do we want and the kind of narratives and story do we want to hear for this nation, and think about how, understand where you live today, or learn more about the people in wherever you grew up. Or I always, a good friend of mine said to me, I'd love our birth certificates to actually state the nation, Aboriginal nation we were born in, not just the hospital. Now, things like that, I think we're seeing that trend towards place names being given back to Aboriginal names. I think they're the really easy things, Deanna, on a day-to-day basis, which we can grab hold of and do our best to try and teach our kids and read stories. I mean, it was nice for me, I guess I can only talk for me, but when we went up to Hopevale a few weeks ago, I came back with a bunch of kids' books from the area up that way, and we read those books to our kids. And we can't read all the language yet, but we're trying to learn it and just slowly give little things like that. I think for me, I guess we're all in our own different parts of our life, but for me, that's the things we can do on a day-to-day basis, which can make a difference on a national stage too. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you. And I really appreciate the point around not just lingering and pointing out the negatives, but creating positive opportunities. That's, as a business owner, that's a really, I guess, positive insight and something I can take on. So thank you so much for your time.
Oh yeah, no, that's good that you're, and that's really good because I am on, I'm on 2 boards. I want to be part, I think business has a really big role to play in this. I probably haven't really talked about that, but I really honestly think business has a massive role to play in this, and it's about creating opportunities for people, diversity in the workforce, all those things that we're sort of switching on to. It's all steps towards getting people out of poverty and people feeling like there's worth and value, and not, it's not like Adam Goods, get back on the, don't you dare to be anything you're not. You get back and be told what you are and blah, blah, blah. No, business is going to lead on that stuff because the government's dragging their feet. The opportunity is there for business to actually take the lead and go, we're not going to wait for the government to do this stuff. We're just going to drive it. And we can see the economics around this stuff matters, and the value in having a diverse workforce or a diverse audience that comes off that diverse workforce. So I think that's really important and a really great point.
Yeah, that thanks for the question, Deanna.
Yeah, thanks, Deanna.
Now, Mary, your question, they're not the same, but I'm going to get you on, and if you feel like your question was answered, just let us know. If not, please ask away. I think it takes a second for the for the mic to clear up. Are you there, Mary?
Here we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you
Yes.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Yeah, I would just like to ask this question. How do we close the gap and ensure that the number of incarcerated Aboriginal women or men and young people is not significantly high?
That's a good question. That's a big answer. Well, firstly, watch the film Incarceration Nation to understand. I think that's really what I wanted to do with the film, was to create something that you could understand and get a sense of the story and the bigger narrative of the nation. And it doesn't tell the entire story, but it tells a big part of the story. Look, like I said before, the biggest drivers to, and again, I'm not a specialist in this space, but the two things that clearly jumped out at me and the research shows is that poverty and disadvantage are the two biggest drivers to all incarceration, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. That is one real clear, obvious thing that we can, as a community and business owners and society, do better to create opportunities around wealth creation and things like that.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, Mary, is this document here. It's called, I'll just get it so you probably can't. So it's called The Pathways to Justice, an inquiry into the incarceration rates of Aboriginal peoples. It's a report that was done by the federal government in December 2017. It was tabled to the then, I can't remember who tabled. It was, so Judge Matthew Myers is in our film. He oversaw this whole report, and it looks forensically at all the aspects of the justice system, and comes away with a bunch of solutions, a bunch of ideas, a bunch of things to address the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people. And this has been given to the federal parliament it's been handed to the government, delivered, but it hasn't been responded to yet. So that was delivered 2018. This had extensive consultation with Aboriginal people, groups, organisations, police, all different aspects of the legal system, and it tries to talk about how you can tailor it towards Aboriginal people. And sadly, it hasn't been addressed or spoken to. And this was the Australian Law Reform Commission oversaw that. So that's one clear thing you can do. I guess coming back to Deanna's question, what can we do? Another thing to do is you can write to your federal member and say, why hasn't this report been spoken to or addressed or recognised by the current government or any government?
I can't believe it hadn't been acknowledged, Dean.
Yeah, it's been tabled. It's been handed over and delivered, and it is chock-a-block. Well, this is the summary, but it's across the entire country and speaks of all the factors at play. It probably doesn't. Yeah, it's probably much more than this as well. But there is so much. It's community-based sentencing, all different things. Bail, the way that bail works. It delves deep into all the different areas, children, all different factors.
Yeah, that's. Can you maybe put the title of that in the chat?
Yeah, I will.
That'd be great. And what I'm going to do, guys, for anyone that hasn't seen Incarceration Nation, I have just put a link to that in the chat as well. So make sure, maybe that's tonight after this, jump on if you haven't watched it and give it a watch. You'll get a lot more understanding, a deeper understanding of what we're talking about, or what Dean's been talking about tonight. I'm going to get Kane on. Kane's got a question as well.
Can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
Sure can.
Awesome. thanks so much, Dean, for joining us tonight and sharing everything you have so far. It's really insightful, and I think conversations that not enough people are privy to. Like Denis said, it's not that he was ignoring it, it's that you know, if you grew up in your major cities around Australia, unless it's somewhere like Darwin, oftentimes you very rarely cross paths with Aboriginal Australians. So I guess my question is, at the moment, you know, with everything we're seeing around Australia with things like lockdowns, more and more conversations are happening around mental health. So do you feel that maybe from the perspective about the generational trauma that Aboriginal Australians have had to deal with, we are potentially one step closer to people actually acknowledging that, you know, trauma has been a massive challenge for Aboriginal Australians, and now that people are, you know, it's almost on trend, people are starting to talk about mental health now. And how can we help facilitate that?
It's a really great point. And it's a really great point you make about, you know, if you don't grow up with Aboriginal families around you, you just, and it's not by choice, it's just the way that you work as a suburb or an area you are, and that's just the nature of what it is, and that's fine. And but I love that there's a willingness to learn and understand. I think that's the real value, and I love sort of seeing that tonight. Mental health, it is on point, clearly, and there's a trend for Aboriginal healing in the community, which I've sort of seen where programs are rolling out bespoke for different regions and areas and peoples, and I think that's a really healthy and good thing. I was going to say something else. I've lost it, so I'm sorry. I've lost
All
it.
good, mate.
If it comes to me, I'll say it. I'm sorry.
And I guess in that circumstance, where you have people, you know, obviously, like you said, the 95%, that stat completely blew me away. I've had the privilege of being able to work in Central Australia and you know, get to know, you know, the real Australia. So massive privilege there. But where can people go to educate themselves a little bit more about, like we're talking about in the book, the Black experience or Aboriginal Australian culture, and that you know, sense of natural healing and connection to country and all of those sorts of things?
Well, I think they're really, without leaving your lounge room, you can flick over to NITV on SBS On Demand and watch a bunch of stories. I mean, that's kind of the point of it, and that's the hope, I think, of the network, is that it's an opportunity for people to get an insight into a world which they don't normally, like you say, you've been lucky enough to go to check out some stuff in person, but a lot of people don't get that opportunity. And I think that's a really easy way to do that. And I think, you know, there's some great authors kicking around, so there's some great things being written and made, and I think you can kind of do that stuff in the comforts of your own home, and that's got to be a really easy low start to sort of understand and get a sense of Aboriginal Australia and what it can offer up for the nation. But it sounds like you're kind of well aware of what that can do anyway. I wish I could think about what I wanted to say for that other question. It's going to come at like 2 p.m. tonight, I think.
just send it to us in an email.
I will.
Maybe record yourself and send it.
I will.
I'll get one more question. Grace, we'd love for you to answer this, to ask your question live.
Awesome.
Let's just see if she's jumped on. Possibly not yet. Give us a second. Here she is. She's popping up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Okay, so I guess my question has sort of been answered already throughout, but mine directly relates to the younger generation. So Dean, I'm an educator, I'm a teacher, high school teacher, I watched Incarceration Nation, and it is very confronting. So I'm not sure that I can show my year 8 or my year 7 students that due to school maybe not letting me. But my question is, what do you think is the first step to opening the conversation to our young generation about these issues, especially when there is maybe like an unfair stigma? Like I feel my school is very good at acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, but the students aren't taking it as seriously as they should be, because I think obviously they play a very, very important role into how the future plays out for First Nation people, etc. So what is your advice on that?
Yeah, it's I feel like I could give advice on the nation. It's really look, thanks Grace for the question. It's really good. And I think there's a couple of things you can possibly do. I think it's about what I sort of said before about the idea of trying to inspire, that Australia uses Aboriginal icons for tourism and all that. Like, I think it's that idea that there's a role there to somehow show young people what Aboriginal aspiration can look like, and that's not just for Aboriginal people. Like, whether that's through singers or sports people or whatever, that social media identity, TikTokers, whatever, and whatever they're watching, is the idea that in those spaces, trying to show that Aboriginal identity is okay, and it's actually more than that. It can be really empowering and really, it's a really hard one. I know. How do you teach young people who probably don't think much beyond themselves just by the nature of being young? It's a really hard thing. And I know I'm just having conversations with NITV and SBS now about what to make next. And they said, we want something sexy. Like, we want something for young people that feels sexy. And it's like, where do you even start with that? Like, so I think it really is about one tool is about trying to, it's almost like showing your students that there are some really big achievements and some really fantastic things going on, and by the way, that they're from an Aboriginal background or whatever. It's really hard. I don't know how it's really to try and shift the value system to think that we value an acknowledgement of country as adults and elder people. We can see that, but to see that through the eyes of a 10-year-old or 12-year-old it's really hard. So, and the other thing which might be more achievable is humour. I don't think humour is a really important tool, Grace, which I think how we can create content or stories of Aboriginal humour and life, which is actually fun and understanding and laughable, and the idea that can bring us together or get a sense of each other and our willingness to understand, I think has a place too. They're pretty vague answers. I'm sorry, Grace, but that's a really hard question. And I don't envy you. Well, I envy you. I get this right. I really respect what you're doing, because it's a really tough gig what you're trying to do, I imagine.
Well, Dean, I think that I respect you because you've actually really answered my question really well, and you've answered it throughout the webinar. So thank you so much. And thank you for producing something like Incarceration Nation to start the conversations anyway. It's really awesome.
Yeah, it does make me think, what would a tool, I mean, as an educator, by the way, there is going to be an atom. This film will have an atom pack, so that will go to the more senior students, I think, and they'll be more of a diluted version for students to take in for the senior students, I think, anyway. But I think humour plays a really important role. Music, all these things that a part of their lives, I guess.
Thanks a lot, Dean. I really
Thanks,
appreciate
Grace.
it.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that question, Grace. Really appreciate it. And I guess Dean, on well, it's been an hour and a half. I think we could definitely talk about this for a very, very long time, because we can just continue to dive and continue to explore. So I definitely want to say thank you so much for your conversation, and for Incarceration Nation, for your time, for everything, because I know for me, I'm definitely one of the 97%. I'm definitely one of the people that I haven't been privy to these conversations or to this sort of information. So having read the book, having watched that, having spoken to you now a couple of times, it's just making me question and look for things that I never would have looked for before. And I'm sure it's done a lot for a lot of other people. So thank you so much for that. Jeannie, did you want to say anything?
Look, I mean, to mirror Denis, a massive thank you. This has been one of my all-time favorite experiences ever. And to align it so well with the book, which is just a collection of incredible stories, which is, at the heart of Incarceration Nation, which has a very powerful message. There are stories, and I think that's what's so important. So thank you. I enjoyed it so much.
Thank you. And look, thank you all. And I hope I did my best. And, I think it really comes down to that bravery. Like, don't underplay your roles, everyone. We should not underplay what we can achieve. And the idea that what does bravery, doesn't have to be, it all can be measured in our own lives. And if you can find some level of that to step up and understand, and I think the willingness to sort of understand and learn and listen. And there's great stuff out there. There's so much at your fingertips from Aboriginal Australia around content and stories and books and things, that it's just so, I think we all be better off for it. If I read more of it, I'd be better off it. We'd all be better off if we got into it. And I think it can add so much more to this nation. And I want you to be brave, because I reckon that's where the future of the nation lies, in all of us being brave and stepping up and saying things like, these systems of incarceration are unacceptable. The way that we treat kids are unacceptable in prisons and all that sort of stuff. And the way that Aboriginal Australia is seen in the light of this nation is unacceptable. It needs to be better. And I think there's so many more we can add bravery to, but I think if we can find that for something, it'd be fantastic. And if you and again, to all of you, if you want to shoot me an email. I'll share my email address here. If you want to shoot me an email and ask me other questions, I'm more than willing to answer and be available to you. So thank you again for organising and putting on the night.
No, of course. Thank you so much. We'll also we'll also have, this is recorded, so we'll put it on the portal. We'll put all of the links inside under Dean's category in the portal. We'll put all of them in there so that you have access to the link to SBS On Demand for Incarceration Nation. You'll have we'll put a link in for the book that you were talking about, Dean. We also added in NITV, a link to NITV, and to Jeannie found earlier today that The Age has a section. Is it just on their site, Jeannie, or is it in the paper as well?
Yeah, so it's in the paper, and I'm not quite sure how frequent, but they've started sharing stories of lived experience I guess in a similar fashion to our book, but through a newspaper. And it's all about leading people into the path to treaty and reconciliation, and everything that's happening around the country, state by state. So yeah, really good resource, I think, for anyone who has access to The Age. It's a really good thing that they do.
Yeah, And we also will be, so we will record, this has been recorded, this is going to be in there, so you can watch this back, you can go through snippets. Grace, this might even be a good resource for you to use to get some of your students to watch. If this is obviously a lot, it's not as confronting and probably not as difficult to show to children, but it might be something that you could utilize. That's totally up to you, just a thought. But then for everyone else, we will also be sharing this. This is one of the expert speaker events that we've run that we're going to open up to all non-members, because we think it's too powerful and too important just to hold it to us. So we'll put it on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. We'll put it on our socials. So if you could all tag people, share it, post about it, and just talk about how you've experienced it, because the more people that watch it, the better. Outside of that, I think that's it from us. Thank you so much, Jeannie. Thank you so much, Dean. And anyone that isn't a member that is watching this, if you do want to get in contact with Dean and you haven't been able to, you haven't got his email address, let us know and we can send it to you. And if you do want to be a part of my book club and get more of these experiences, which we do multiple every month, send us a message, any of our social media, Instagram, Facebook, email, or jump on the website and you can find out more. That's it from me. That's it from us. Thank you so much. Have a great night. Really appreciate your time, Dean.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.